Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, the last one we have before the presidential election in the US. My name is Berit Enge. I'm a writer and former diplomat. I'm usually based in Washington, but this year we have moved the family to Oslo due to the COVID situation. I have partnered with my friend Benja Fagerland and her very impressive network, the SHEconomy network, to host a series of webinars. Some of you have been with us already. We've done this over the last 3 weeks or so, and now we're getting very, very close to the big day. The idea was to host a series of webinars with impressive Washington women who are very close to what is happening there before the election. And over the past month or so, we've had several excellent conversations with women who have contributed to our understanding of the election and helped us understand why this coming week's election could be such a momentous event in history. We are hoping to develop this into a longer-term program, and if all goes well, we would like for some of you to join us in Washington at some point when the world opens up again, to meet some of these women. Today we have with us Professor Kim Whaley. Hello, Kim.
Hi,
welcome. She's a lawyer, author, and an expert on the U.S. Constitution and on the U.S. voting system. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. Understanding the U.S. electoral system can be a bit technical, and sometimes it's hard to see how the system itself plays to the final outcome, but Kim will bring this to life for us, and I guarantee you that some of the things that you will hear today will be not only surprising, but maybe borderline shocking. With us in the audience today are participants from Norway, from Denmark, and from Iceland, and we thank all of you for joining us today. The format will be the same as what we've had the previous weeks. Kim and I will start off the conversation, and then we will welcome your questions on the chat as we go along. I'd like to, before we start, thank our digital partner, Digital Norway. And as before, it is Silje Molandstø who's helping us get this show on the road. And we would like to also send a special thank you to CEO of Digital Norway, Liv Dingsør. This webinar will be taped and it will be available on the SHEconomy website for those who could not join us here today. Let me start by telling you a little bit more about Kim Whaley. She has a very impressive list of accomplishments. She's an author, she's a lawyer, a law professor, and legal expert. She is much in demand, and I am pretty sure these days she's not sleeping much. She has served as a legal analyst for CBS News, and she is a regular guest on MSNBC, CNN, BBC, and NPR, and she has also appeared on Fox News, C-SPAN, and PBS. She contributes to a number of media outlets, including Politico, The Atlantic, The Bulwark, and The Hill, and she's also written for the Baltimore Sun and LA Times. She is a former assistant United States attorney, was associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation, and she is the author of 2 books. Her first book was How to Read the Constitution and Why, and her most recent book is What You Need to Know About Voting and Why. This book was recently called shouted out, I guess we could say, by Nora O'Donnell, the anchor of CBS Evening News, as a book that she said, and I quote, is a must-read, especially in an election year. Kim and I did not meet through the regular work channels. I guess before we start, I could just mention some keywords. We are, I guess, almost neighbors in the Washington area. Of course, in the US, in high school, one very big deal is the prom, the dance that they have their senior year. I have a son named Eric, who is 21, and Kim has a delightful daughter named Isabel, who is also 21. And I think I'll leave it at that. So, Kim, let me start by asking you, why did you write a book about voting and why did you write it now?
Well, first, let me thank you, Barrett, and everyone that was involved in organizing this event. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to speak to people across the pond, but also a group of women, frankly, because I think that for a lot of reasons, female energy, I have 4 daughters, is a pathway to a better future in a lot of ways. But the reason I wrote the book actually stems back to my first book that you mentioned, How to Read the Constitution and Why. I've been a tenured law professor for 10 years, been writing scholarly articles about the separation of powers, and realized early in the Trump administration, there's such a lack of basic civic literacy around the Constitution, even among the press. I mean, I read a piece in the New York Times that just had something that was inaccurate, and that what's frankly prompted me to write my first piece for the Baltimore Sun. And then that sort of snowballed, and I started doing a lot of media, and there really is a hunger for translating these concepts into language that makes sense. And this is really in my lifetime. I mean, Nixon, and there was impeachment of Clinton, but this is the first time in my lifetime where American democracy really is in serious jeopardy. And so after the first book, came to the realization that seems obvious, but it took me a whole book to realize it, that voting is the fulcrum of everything in American democracy. If people don't have access to the ballot, everything else that they care about doesn't really matter. It could be LGBTQ rights, it could be the environment, it could be the economy, it could be healthcare, all of those things. But only approximately 50% of Americans vote in any election. That might change the statistics this round because the turnout is so amazing. But the number one reason that the Knight Foundation organization did a study in January of this year, the number one reason Americans don't vote is they think their vote doesn't matter. And so again, I just decided we need to have basic civic education and an understanding of how our electoral process works in America and why it does matter, even if you're in a solidly Republican or red state or solidly blue or Democratic state. And so the idea is, and the hope is, to get these volumes in every classroom in America so that people go to the polls with basic knowledge that empowers them to have their own agency and not have so much we have such a polarized culture in America now where people get agency from being on a team and smearing the other team. And my objective, and I have a third book coming out next summer called Common Sense, about how to make these decisions for yourself, involving, basic core legal education principles, translating that into regular life. But my objective really is to empower people with core information so they can feel agency that's not around polarization.
Give us a brief overview of voting rights in the United States. We know that this year is the 100th anniversary for women's vote in the US. We also know that voting rights on the books did not always lead to real voting rights. So give us the sort of the 101 ABC on the voting rights in the US.
Okay. So the Constitution was ratified finally in 1788. And at that time, we were a collection of states, and there was a lot of ambiguity, or I should say anxiety, about what the federal government was going to look like. And so there was a compromise made between the states and the newly formed federal government that election administration and how the right to vote is implemented would stay in the states. So for that reason, there's actually no clear statement of the right to vote in the original United States Constitution. And as a result, unlike other rights under the Constitution, you might have heard of the First Amendment, right to free speech and religion, or the Fourth Amendment right to be free of arbitrary searches and seizures by the police of your home. Those rights are consistent across the United States, but the right to vote varies based on where you live. So if you live in Oregon or Washington State, where they have very liberal laws relating to access to the polls, where you can register on the first day, the day you walk in, or you can vote by mail, your right to vote is very different than if you live in, say, Florida, where you have to register a month in advance, and there are difficult identification requirements. And of course, there's been, some of you may have heard, a big flap around whether the Floridians' decision at the ballots to allow people with felony convictions to vote, whether that actually holds. I mean, that disenfranchises thousands and thousands of Floridians. So we are still in America 230 years later having a debate over whether the right people should be able to vote. So there was the right to vote has been implied in the Constitution by the Supreme Court, even though it's not expressed. And there are 6 times through amendments to the Constitution that the voting tent has been opened. So we're an opt-in system. You have to show that you are entitled to vote. It's not like other democracies where you're automatically registered. So originally, only white men who owned land, who had wealth, were able to actually vote. That franchise tent was opened in the 15th Amendment to allow formerly enslaved men to vote. The 19th Amendment 100 years ago to allow women to vote. There was a later amendment to allow people between the ages of 18 and 21 to vote, et cetera, the residents of the District of Columbia. We've seen this voting tent open and open and open, but there still is this sort of stinginess around voting amongst many people in America. And when the 15th Amendment was ratified to allow formerly enslaved males to vote, what happened then in primarily the southern states, but many states, most of the slavery in the United States was in the southern states, the states started passing arbitrary laws that were supposed to be maintaining integrity in elections, but were really designed to keep formerly enslaved people from the ballot box. For example, requiring that the person recite the Declaration of Independence, or estimate the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. That was an actual law in the South. That essentially was impossible to answer that question. So that would keep people from the polls, even though they had a constitutional right to vote. So Congress in 1965 passed the Voting Rights Act after a lot of hard-fought effort by Martin Luther King, other civil rights leaders, a huge political capital expended by President Johnson, LBJ, finally got the Voting Rights Act passed. That made a big difference in voting. It essentially banned certain practices that we now call voter suppression, including requiring that you pay to vote, for example, poll taxes. That keeps low-income people from the polls. In 2013, the United States Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional a key part of that statute. So because that's now no longer banned by law, court made it legal again, we are seeing the states come back with laws that are designed essentially to keep primarily low income and people of color and people that are more progressive and would change the demographic of the electorate to keep them from voting. So when you see on the news coverage of laws relating, for example, to not allowing more than one drop-off box per county in the state of Texas, that is a voter suppression tactic. That makes people drive 90 minutes in a pandemic to drop off their ballot. And it's very blatant right now. It's the Republican Party across the country that are using the courts, filing lawsuits to make it harder for people to vote, to cut off early voting, to not allow counting of ballots after November 3rd if they were put in the mails, to limit drop box access, to challenge certain signatures on mail-in votings as somehow fraudulent. This is still a debate, and it's often framed in the terms of fraud, but fraud is a crime in the United States. Voter fraud, it carries a 5-year prison sentence at the federal level. So that's a myth. There isn't fraud. There is election mistakes, and that's primarily because the states have to use their own budgets to actually implement elections. Congress hasn't given them any serious money since Bush versus Gore in 2000. And the Senate under Senator Mitch McConnell has blocked legislation to actually fund the election. That would have been the COVID legislation that passed, the HEROES Act that passed the House back in May, would have funded the elections, would have funded the Postal Service to allow mail-in ballots. But not only did we not, as Americans, see either of those bills even get to the floor in the Senate, but of course that would also have given much needed additional COVID relief to Americans when now the cases, as in Europe, are spiking in very disturbing ways here in America.
So do you see the 2013 decision by the Supreme Court as the first step in a larger play to limit voting?
Yeah, I think it's that one as well as the case known as Citizens United. So the Supreme Court struck down two important pieces of legislation that the United States Congress passed in order to fix the electoral system. I mentioned the Voting Rights Act. There was another bill that was known as the McCain-Feingold bill, which was designed to essentially keep corporate and foreign and billionaire dollars out of the electoral campaign finance system. So Americans can only give $2,700 per person to any one candidate by law, because the idea is we don't want a system where someone like me with $3,000 could buy influence in office. The Supreme Court then held that corporations have First Amendment rights, speech rights, not just the human beings that comprise the boards on these or the management of these corporations, but the actual legal fiction itself. And that they can then spend, anyone can spend, I could spend, or corporations could spend as much money as they want through speech ads on issues. I don't have billions of dollars. So we're now in a system in America where, thanks to the United States Supreme Court, we have corporations, billionaires, dark money where we don't even know where it comes from, spending millions of dollars on ads that regular people can't afford. And that's affecting our elections, and it's affecting how politicians are giving, where their loyalties are lying. Because even though it's illegal to actually coordinate between the ads and the candidates of course know exactly who is paying for the ad, so they know who they owe once they get in office. So yes, those are the two great points. The two key pillars of electoral attempts through the elected officials in government, the legislative branch, trying to fix our electoral process. And then we have unelected lifetime justices striking that down. So we're in this vicious cycle. And a lot of people are worried about Amy Coney Barrett striking down abortion rights. But I'm more concerned that under a Biden administration, if there is a Democratic Senate as well, that we will see electoral and voting rights legislation, then it would go to the conservative court, and that court would strike the legislation down. That's my concern.
That was the new just named new part of the Supreme Court. I wanted to also tie in with that the importance of the census in the U.S., because it seems to me that there are so many parts of, well, we hear a little bit of this here and a little bit of that there, but there are so many of these parts that really are connected. And for example, the importance of the census, which in the United States is done every 10 years to see who's there basically and where they are. And we've seen also in the Norwegian press quite a lot written about, for example, Trump's attempt to limit the census this year, to limit the time that it can be done in, to shorten the time, so presumably fewer people will participate, and also controversial issues regarding what you can ask about. For example, if you ask about whether or not you have you're legally in the United States, that would keep a lot of people away from wanting to answer that particular form. So can you tell us a bit about how this links in with what's going on?
Sure. So, and forgive I have dogs barking in the background, but I was told it's okay.
We all like dogs.
Our COVID world, right? Okay. So great question. So the United States Census is established by the Constitution, and under the Constitution, it essentially refers to human beings. It doesn't slice and dice whether you're a citizen or not. It counts heads, actual people per state. The reason that's important is because that number is used to decide how many delegates to the House of Representatives each state gets. So by law, there's 435 members of the House of Representatives. That many people, including myself, really thinks that's outdated. Population has gone up. We need more people in Congress, but that's another topic. But essentially right now, there's 435 slices of the Congress pie in the House of Representatives. And based on the numbers of the census, the more people in a state, the more members they get in the House. That's the connection. And the Electoral College, which actually chooses presidents, the number of votes in the Electoral College is tied to the number of members in the House of Representatives. So say you take up a state and say you've got a huge immigrant influx in maybe, let's say, the state of California. I don't actually know the numbers lately, but assume we've got more immigrants in the state of California. If there are higher numbers in the state of California in the census than there were 10 years ago, as a result, because those people are counted, California will get more members of the House of Representatives potentially, and more members in the Electoral College. So there'd be greater influence of that population for choosing a president. So this is the reason that the Trump administration has tried to kneecap the census process a number of ways. One is by construing the language of the Constitution through the Secretary of Commerce, who answers to the president and conducts the census. It's actually under the Constitution, Congress is supposed to conduct the census, but sort of handed that power off to the Secretary of Congress, because the Secretary of Commerce, decided, well, we're just going to count citizens. That decision went to Supreme Court for technical reasons. The Supreme Court struck it down, which was upsetting to Republicans, but was the right decision. Chief Justice Roberts, a conservative, joined the majority in that. So they haven't been able to count citizens. But of course, it's the disenfranchised, the people that aren't on the radar, that are harder to find. I mean, I got my census ballot in my email in my house, and I just logged on and filled it out, or maybe I might have gotten in the mail. I know I filled out my census online. We've seen it during COVID, there are 40 million households in America that still don't have internet. These poor kids, low-income children are having to go to school in a McDonald's parking lot because they don't have access to the internet. So these are the people that are harder to find during a census. And so under the American system, once the original, the census forms go out, they get the original sort of the first wave of information. There are individual census counters, people that literally go door to door and try to get information from people that are even homeless people to count the human beings. So the Trump administration's done a couple things, cut short that timing, and the Supreme Court unfortunately authorized that. So those people that wouldn't otherwise be counted because they're hard to find will not be counted, and they're generally not going to be Republican voters. The other thing we've seen under a Trump administration, of course, is a severe crackdown on even legal immigration. We've all heard about the horrific kids in cages. Of course, people that are undocumented that are here, as well as even naturalized citizens that are here, are afraid now of the government because they don't want to be arrested and sent and separated from their families. And some of them sent back to countries. They're here, because they're evading some kind of hardship in their country, which asylum is legal. They're not illegal, but they're afraid of communicating with the government because there's such severe penalties. So even the people that are going door to door are having a hard time in some areas getting answers because there's so much fear among people that weren't necessarily born in America, but might be legal immigrants or might be seeking status here, or might not be documented. There's so much fear that there'll be retribution just by being identified, that we will see successfully, unfortunately, a suppression of the citizenship count, or the census count, and then that will affect all elections between now and 10 years from now.
And then you have the issue of how the congressional districts are drawn, and all of these things sound very, very kind of technical, but it constantly surprises me how these things influence the politics, not just on the state and local level, but also on the national level, because obviously it all ties together. You mentioned the census, the electoral college, the who gets what numbers. I wonder if you could speak a little bit specifically to the gerrymandering, the redistricting that follows after the census, where it is decided how the districts will, what the districts will look like. And some of them nowadays look really, really weird if you look at them on a map. You had a sentence in your book that I thought was really good, where you described gerrymandering as something that lets politicians pick their voters, not the other way around. And that, of course, sounds kind of ominous. So tell us what goes on there and what you expect. And I'd like to tag on to that also. It seems to me that by building a lot of power in states, which the Republicans have done by way of getting governors elected and getting majorities in state government, ties into a longer term plan, bringing us up to some of the things that we see today. So what happened? Where were the Democrats would be my second question when all this was going on.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the states decide a lot about our electoral process. That was a compromise. And the idea was in part to not have so much power in the federal government, and to also to make sure the smaller states have a voice. And also, as I mentioned, it was an end run around slavery, frankly, because the southern states didn't want to count slaves. But part of that is the state legislatures, not the federal legislature, the state legislatures. They decide how to carve up their land for purposes of handing certain areas to vote for particular members of Congress. So remember, before I said 435 people in the House of Representatives. Say, a particular state has 4 based on the census. The state legislature then would decide what parts of the state will vote for each of those representatives. So you could say you've got a square state. Here's my book. You could imagine a state just doing it in a natural way, that one goes to this corner, one goes to this corner, one goes to this corner, one goes to this corner. Instead, what's happened, both on the Democratic and the Republican side, which gets to your second question, when the legislature at the state level gets to, after the census, carve up their districts, if it's majority Republican, they will create what we call a gerrymandered district. It's after the name of a member of Congress that kind of first sort of spearheaded this idea. Is they basically identify on the pop from a map, and now you can do it with big data. It's much more precise. They can identify, okay, we're a Republican legislature. Let's find the Republicans in the state, and we'll combine them all together, and we'll make them a single district. So you see these states, they look like salamanders or snakes. They wind in these completely bizarre configurations because the, say, Democratic or Republican majority of the state decides we want to make it all Republican. People are never going to change, so that even if the rest of the state might be primarily going a different direction, you can never flip that district. Likewise, they might take something, say a Democrat might say, okay, now we're in charge. Here's a solidly Democratic district. We're going to break it up and make sure the Democrats can't vote together anymore. And that way they'll never have a member of Congress. So that's called cracking and stacking. Cracking is when you break up something to make it never possible that constituent can actually vote for a member of Congress anymore, or stacking it, creating these tortured districts. So
that may look something like this.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Both sides do it, mostly the Republicans. And what it means is that state legislature picks their voters. And even if the voters want a different person or a different party for their district, they can never do it, because it's the configuration of their district is so one-sided that the people can't flip it. Now, this question came to the Supreme Court again, to our discussion of the Supreme Court last year. And the majority, conservative majority, even with Ruth Bader Ginsburg still on the court, said listen, that's for the politicians. We are not going to deal with that, even if it's unconstitutional. They said it might be unconstitutional because it could potentially violate the Equal Protection Clause, which is basically a fairness doctrine. But that's for politicians. We're out of it. So the problem, of course, is, how do you change that if the gerrymandered politicians are invested in continuing gerrymandering? So one of the things I mentioned, HR number one of the things that is in that legislation by Congress that Mitch McConnell in the Senate has refused to bring up in Congress, in the Senate, would be a federal law that would move the power to carve up districts from state legislatures to neutral commissions. So you'd have a neutral group that would basically decide it based on fairness and not on politics. Now, of course, if something like that were to pass, as I mentioned earlier, the problem is, would a conservative 6-3 majority strike that down? I don't know. It very well could. That's this loop we're in, this, catch-22, if you know the famous novel.
Yeah. Let me just quickly stop and tell our listeners that we would be very happy to take questions. So please, if you have questions, put them on the webinar chat, and we will pass the questions on to Kim. Let me move on to what has been a major theme, of course, in all the talks that we have had in these webinars, and that is, what can we expect happening in the next months and years under a Trump presidency, and what can we expect under a Biden presidency? And let me add to that, what could we expect? Let's start with this. What could we expect under a Biden presidency with a Democratic majority in the Senate?
So very different worlds. And this is the part I think that gets a little scary for people. The Biden presidency, if there's a Democratic Senate, we will see some legislation actually start to happen. There's a majority of American voters right now want things like measured gun control. I know that people in Europe and other parts of the world think we're cuckoo about the gun thing. We do have the Second Amendment, but if you talk to even, avid gun owners, most of them, even on, the very conservative wing, do want something. They do think there should be some background checks, for example, so convicted criminals don't get them. But that won't get past a conservative Republican majority in the Senate. Immigration reform, that's been wanted for decades by a majority of the Americans. It's not going anywhere. Of course, COVID relief, people want it. It's not going anywhere. We saw a conservative justice to the Supreme Court push through days before an election. That's a whole other conversation, but we can't get COVID relief, key elements. So healthcare, that's in front of the Supreme Court on the 10th as well. But Americans do want healthcare. That's one of the top polling issues, that kitchen table concerns of Americans. People want to see it. It's not happening. This Republican majority has been trying to kill healthcare. So I think we will see more legislation, finally, actually substantive policy happen in America. That's number one, we'll see. Number two, we could see, like we saw post-Watergate when Nixon he wasn't impeached. He resigned before he was formally impeached, but there was an investigation. We saw a lot of legislation around ethics and accountability in government. I think we'll see that again. Because of the Black Lives Matter movement across the globe, there's a big call, understandably, there's another, African-American male killed by police this week in America. It's sickening. We will see police reform. We are going to see criminal justice reform in a good way, because in America, frankly, the police do too much. We don't have a social service network like we do in other countries. So the police have to be marriage counselors, domestic abuse, crisis hotline, volunteers. They have to deal with mental health illness. They have to deal with physical illness. They're doing more than just managing crime. That needs to change. Now, again, whether this legislation under a Biden administration gets struck down the Supreme Court is a huge problem. So, but that's where we are. I think there are people in the conservative end of American politics that are concerned about the Biden Harris ticket, not so much because of Biden, but because Harris is number two. Biden has indicated he won't have probably take two terms. You never know. But that's that's another conversation around race and frankly, misogyny in America and other things. That's a Biden administration. Under 4 more years of a Trump administration, we will see the end of American democracy. And that, of course, has deep impact across the globe. I had a reporter from the Netherlands. A crew came on because I did the News Hour last week, the program in the Netherlands, and they were saying, how worried they are there because so much of what happens in Europe follows on what happens in America. The reason I say it's the end of American democracy is because the Trump administration has destroyed the civil service apparatus in the executive branch. So they've basically gone through and purging non-Trump loyalists from the ranks of the civil service. They've attacked science. They've attacked experts. They've attacked lifetime public servants for serving the public interest, not Trump's interest. And a compliant Congress, as we've seen, has basically allowed him to do whatever he wants with no limitations. So that's no longer a democracy. It's not functioning, as I say, to hand out tickets for speeding in the White House. And even the First Amendment, which is, some people think, too strong of a bulwark in American life for a number of reasons. I mean, it tolerates hate speech, for example. But even that will probably go by the wayside. We saw the Trump administration use violence against reporters in front of the White House so that he could cross the street and hold a Bible upside down in front of a church that he does not attend for a political photo op. That is a chilling moment. Federal force being used against a free press. I mean, there was a reporter who lost her eye in skirmishes with the federal government. But we're in a moment where there's just so much coming at us as Americans. It's hard to process and get on top of all of it. But I would suspect that will be pushed forward, where people who spoke out, including possibly someone like me, not against Trump, but I'm not necessarily against Trump. I'm for the rule of law. I'm for the Constitution surviving for my children, that there will be pushback against people like us, and it will just fundamentally change the fabric of American democracy and American culture.
Well, it's a pretty chilling outlook. Of course, I'm asking you to speculate, but what do you think will happen next week? I assume we will not have the results of the election right away. What would be your personal expectation? What will next week look like?
I think it depends in part. I'm not an expert in polling. I mean, I have friends that are political pundits that know the map, know the races exquisitely. My understanding, and which is as good as anyone else's on this call that's read about this, is that there are certain what we call purple or swing states that are critical. You have to get 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency. And so there are people that have sort of mapped out the pathways to the presidency for each candidate. For Biden, there are many ways he can get to the presidency. It's almost like going through a maze. What people have said, and I'm crediting them given their reputation, is that if Donald Trump loses Florida, there is no alternative pathway to the presidency. His only pathway to the presidency includes a state like Florida, perhaps Pennsylvania, perhaps North Carolina. So there are a few states that are absolutely vital. Florida does count their votes very early relative to the other states. Pennsylvania later. So there will be delays. However, if, for example, we know within the first couple of days that he lost Florida, then we could be in a very good posture where even if he declares victory, which he probably will, regardless of the vote, the inertia, the understanding, the media coverage, it, the disbelief that he could possibly win will be so great that we will be on a track for a legitimate election of Joe Biden. If we see some of these swing states with close margins, then all hell literally breaks loose. And I say that because it's a win for the forces against American democracy that are now unfortunately entrenched in the White House, and who is White House that's close to Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's a win for the forces against American democracy to just create chaos, to just create a situation we don't know who the president is. Litigation, fights, it goes to the House, it goes to the Senate, it goes to the legislature. I mean, there are so many ways that if the election is close, that it could just be such a mess that then it becomes a fist fight for who stays in the White House. And then American democracy and elections itself are so corroded that I don't know who we are going forward. So there's more of a risk, or as much of a risk, from the chaos as there is from this kind of a person in the White House for 4 more years.
And based on your background, your very, very detailed knowledge of the voting system, what is your assessment of how fair the election can be?
Well, we've heard reports recently that there's been infiltration by the Russians of some of the systems of the elections in the United States. I mean, every state and even some precincts have their own system. And most of them, or many of them, are old and outdated. And the software and the hardware, the actual pieces of equipment that are used to vote, are controlled by third-party private vendors in many cases. It's not something that's regulated by the government, so there's lots of opportunity. That being said, I think it's fair in that we're seeing, again, extraordinary outpouring by Americans. People are literally in COVID scraping together their last few $100s, their reports, to get on airplanes and to fly to their home state to actually cast a ballot because they don't trust the mails and they know how important it is to vote in America right now. That's unbelievable. So there will be people that will fall by the wayside, but I don't think it will. I think there's a possibility, a strong possibility, if it happens, that the polling numbers translate into the votes as expected that are very pro-Biden right now, that it will be a fair election. Does that mean certain people were left out unfairly? Yes. But with enough numbers, we will get through to the other side. And my hope in that moment is not just that we will see this legislation that I've talked about that will start fixing problems for America, but that this conversation around civics, around the American Constitution and voting will continue past. What I don't want to see is, okay, we're through this nightmare and we're back at it in 4 years because we've forgotten about it and people are just as uneducated about it as they were beforehand. That's my hope, which is why I'd like to see these books that are behind me in every classroom in America at some point before people finish their formal education.
Do you think any of these changes, the ones that you have outlined about the voting system and about the improving the democracy system, do you think any of these will be high on the agenda for a Biden administration, and would they be able to do something about it, especially given what the legal courts look like now, and legal paths would be difficult?
All of that depends on what the political capital is, right? So traditionally in America, the first 100 days of a new administration, that's where they can make the most impact most quickly. And Obama put his elbow grease behind healthcare. Some thought he did it too fast. He did it too much because it was so partisan in terms of how it went down that there just wasn't buy-in. I don't know. That's a complicated question, but he had promised to do something on immigration. He did, and he got a lot of criticism. So the question will be, what does Biden prioritize? I would like to see voting prioritized. It was the priority of the House of Representatives when they took over, when the Democrats took over in 2018. HR 1, the first bill, which is like, that's kind of that shows priority. The first bill was a sweeping reforms to our voting electoral system. So given that, I do think this will be on the table for him. But of course, he's got, all these other issues. He's got a slagging economy. He's got a virus that is completely out of control. He's got Black Lives Matter and police violence that he needs to deal with. And then there will be, depending on how things shake out, there will be, I think, pressure from his voters to do something to hold the people in the White House under Trump, including Trump himself, accountable for the abuses of office, which are too many to even list right now. So he's got a lot. Yeah. I don't know.
And if he calls you,
people, he'll have good, competent people.
And if he calls you and says, what are the top 3 issues that we need to look at when it comes to voting, what would you say?
Automatic voter registration when you turn 16 or 18 in America. I think that would be a huge change, and it's in that bill. It's hard to register here, and it's hard to stay on the polls here. We need to see the culture of voting shift, where you pay your taxes not because you think the IRS is going to audit you, because they don't, but just it's what you do. We need that to be, and I know that's kind of hard to believe in other parts of the world, automatic voter registration, same day voter registration. You walk into the polls and you can register that day. That would be my top reforms, and it's in that bill. I would also like to see a line item budget every year going to states to actually fund elections and infrastructure to make sure that they're secure, so we can take this fraud conversation off the table. So that's what I think in terms of reforms. What I think it's important to look at in terms of what happens between now and next week, this is an important statistic to keep in mind. The Republican base is primarily older white Americans, and increasingly males, and increasingly people in rural areas without a lot of post-secondary education. In America, the demographics, the statistic that I heard is that less than 50% of kids under the age of 16 are white right now. That means more than 50% are children of color. In 2 years, they will start voting. The demographic is going to look very different in 5-10 years, which is why some people believe there's been such an effort by Republicans led by Mitch McConnell to pack the federal courts with this minority viewpoint that's dying in America, this white male dominance viewpoint. So I think that is something to look at, the youth vote. And the other piece is, what is the Republican Party? I have, friends, colleagues of mine that are longstanding Republicans that I deeply, deeply respect. The Republican Party is in this no man's land right now. They're going to need to decide, who are they? Can they recapture this notion of fiscal responsibility? Because this administration has put us in record deficits, $1.3 trillion in tax cuts to corporations and rich people. That's not a core Republican value. Racial tolerance, right? It's the Republican Party that spearheaded Reconstruction after the Civil War and attempting to bring formerly enslaved people back into American culture, not the Democrats. So they have to decide where's our future? How do we get that the new voter constituency to care about what we have to say? I mean, right now it's just been destroyed. And if they can't, then what is the party system? Because so much of of politics in America is around this two-party system, which is not in the Constitution. Mm. So there are ways of maybe ranked choice voting, other things to bring more parties into the system. I don't know, but it's both a scary and a very exciting time in American politics, because we could really see positive shifts that frankly could not have happened under a Hillary Clinton administration. There's a possibility of tremendous opportunity out of this darkness that would not have happened if we hadn't gone through this, this dark period.
Yeah.
I was reminded by what you said just now about the events of 2012 when the Republicans did very badly in the election, and there was a report written afterwards that concluded exactly what you were alluding to, that the U.S. demographically was changing so much that the party had to change, and it had to change in ways that it made them appeal to the minorities and to women. And I remember reading that, or at least parts of that report, and thinking this was very promising, and it looked very future oriented. But then obviously we are where we are today, and it's in some ways a mystery how that could have happened.
Well, I mean, let me just add to that, Barrett. The polling shows Trump has lost women. I mean, that's a primary group that have fled him. Because a lot of us are moms and have just decided enough is enough. This is completely unacceptable. So that's another really interesting demographic. He said at a rally a week or two ago, where, why don't suburban women like me? There's an excellent, if anyone's interested, there's an excellent episode on the New York Times podcast, which is called The Daily. It's only 20 minutes. It was this week, and it was about Ohio, where my daughter Isabel's in school. And long-standing Republican voters, women who are explaining why they're leaving Trump and the Republican Party. It's a fascinating episode to get a sort of a look into what regular suburban women in America are thinking in this moment. I highly, highly recommend it.
Thank you.
I tweeted it, by the way. I tweeted the episode. So if you also want to not have to hunt and peck for it, just follow me at Kim Whaley, WEHLE, on my Twitter. And also, I'm actually taking over the Harper Collins Instagram today, so you can follow me on Harper Collins today. I'll be chatting about a lot of this stuff today too.
Well, I'm happy to say I'm already following you on Twitter, and I'll follow you in the other place too.
Thank you.
But I'm glad you're putting in there a little bit of an optimistic view also, because there are things happening that at least make me think that maybe what we're seeing are changes that will also make the voting system better. For example, we're seeing a huge increase in states that will allow people to vote in advance, and the COVID pandemic will obviously make people reluctant to go to the voting to the ballot box, but it seems like there are now it's made a little easier for people to vote. And I'm wondering what do you think that trend will continue, and do you think it'll make a big difference in terms of, I heard there was 60 million votes given already, something like that?
It's over 70 now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, a few months ago it was vote by mail, then the president did some shenanigans with the Postal Service, so then people were saying, drop off your ballot, and then the Supreme Court struck down or basically refused to allow Wisconsin last week to vote late, or to count their ballots late. So we now, I think people are understanding that between the Postal Service delays and the Supreme Court cutting off counting their ballots, even if they're received by November 3rd, challenge is going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's not going to allow ballot counting after November 3rd, depending on the facts of the particular case. People are dropping their ballots off or showing up. I do think, so a lot of changes have happened across the country. Some of them were just temporary for COVID. Some of them were permanent. So 5 states and the military have almost exclusively voted by mail for years. People like it, and participation is higher for both Democrats and Republicans in those states, because you get your ballot, you sit down with a cup of coffee, you get online, and you get to know the candidates. You can take your time. It's a lot more convenient, even not in a pandemic. And you've probably seen on TV these insane lines now, people waiting 10, 11, 12 hours in line to vote in America. So in some of those states, it's already permanent. They made permanent changes, so that will carry over more access to ballot by mail. Prior to COVID, there was still mail-in balloting, but you needed an excuse. That's still the case in some parts of the country, like New York. You need an excuse. I have a disability, or I'm going to be out of the country at that time. So I think you're right, to the extent to which some states hold on to that should see more voting just based on the statistics, because it's easier to vote. The flip side, the problem is what we're seeing is you don't have a poll worker there to answer questions when you're doing it at home. And so it's easier to make mistakes. So over the summer, during the midterms, or the primaries, excuse me, 550,000 ballots were disqualified that were mailed in for two primary reasons. One, they were too late. The Postal Service had delays. And we saw the Postal Service was cutting services, saying we don't need money, but we're going to cut services, which a lot of Americans are like, that's not, doesn't pass the straight face test. And the second was just not signing at the right place or putting it in the right envelope, these kind of technical details that if it's your first time voting by mail, you might not realize what you're supposed to do. And you call your cousin in Nebraska and their mail-in ballot looks different than your mail-in ballot. That's part of the problem is it's different all over the country. So people are going to make mistakes, and those people, some states you can fix it. In some states, the law says, listen, if you signed the wrong place, the state needs to call you up, let you know that you can come in and fix it. Other states, you're out of luck. Your ballot doesn't count.
Yeah. I read your tweet when you had voted, and I read your comment about feeling so good about it. So let's hope that this is the election where more people realize how important it is to cast that vote, and that they do feel good about it. And I can't vote, but I have contributed by taking my husband's vote to the Norwegian post office and getting it off in time. So that felt pretty good too. Kim, thank you very much for being with us today. I think we have learned a lot. I think we are all looking forward to your new book, and we wish you all the best in what will surely be busy days for you in the days and weeks to come. And to our listeners, please join us again after the election. We will, on the 4th of November, have an analysis of however much we know about the election at that point, and we will have 3 guests from different parts of American political life, and so that'll be 3 o'clock on November 4th, and we hope that you will be with us then. Thanks again, Kim, and give my best to your girls and your dogs, and hope to see you when we get back to the States.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation and really excellent questions. Best of luck to everyone. I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.